What's up, students? Hello, Tristan here. So I know normally Nick does these videos for you guys, but since I'm going to be stepping into the ministry director role, I'm going to start taking over your home group videos, so you get to see my beautiful mug every single week. Nonetheless, obviously, welcome to week 2, our first week of home groups. And tonight, what we're really going to be talking about is being humbled. Really, humility is something that I think in our culture is like really, really low right now. And something that we hear all the time is do you, be you, do what you want to do. But if we're just being honest, that's kind of exactly opposite of what Scripture tells us to do. So we're really going to get into a story of how humility was something that one person really needed, and they really didn't have it. And because they didn't have it, it actually got them killed. Yeah, some kind of lesson to be learned from that. But before we start, I want to share with you guys just a really quick, small story of how me not having humility, right? Me being kind of arrogant and overconfident, got me into a bit of a trouble, like a trouble spot. So when I was in high school, I was in JROTC, which most people know that about me because I usually tell a lot of people I took a lot of pride in it for a while there. I was in JRTC and I was on the drill team, which the best way to explain that is it's organized walking. Uh, and so, really, it's just we had a routine, walked around, I yelled commands. It was one of my favorite things to do. And we were at a competition one freezing November morning, and I had to command, one of these demonstrations, if you want to call it that. And so, I really had to stay on a good pace. I had to have all my things memorized. But since I thought I was probably the greatest thing to ever happen to the world of JROTC, I was like, I don't need to study or anything like that. Like, I'll be fine. No need. And well, I actually ended up skipping over like an entire block of commands, which if you can, probably tell is a very bad idea. If any of you guys have ever had to do anything that's like a routine that you had to memorize and you skip over an entire part of the routine, needless to say, we didn't even place, and I was absolutely heartbroken. I got scolded by my commander at the time, and it was just not a good time. And that's exactly what happens when our head gets a little too big. We start assuming that we're going to know what we need to do. We start becoming overconfident, and we think that we can do whatever we need just in our own power. And the fact of the matter is, it's just not the case. And so the whole point of the story that I'm about to describe to you guys in 2 Samuel chapter 15 is kind of what happens when your head gets too big, and seeing the downfalls of that. Seeing the downfalls of what happened when we become overconfident, when we become arrogant in believing that, we deserve something that really we don't, or that we deserve something that, maybe we haven't really worked for, or that we just think we deserve because we are who we are. So tonight we're going to discuss the story of Absalom and his kind of rise and almost immediate downfall due to his pride. So real quickly, Absalom is the son of David, and David also, the famous David of David and Bathsheba, the great king of Israel, one of the premier characters in Scripture. This is his son, Absalom. And where we're at this point is we're kind of getting to a point where David has been slightly neglecting Israel at this point. He's been kind of slightly neglecting his people. And because of that, Absalom is going to take this opportunity in his own pride to say that he could run the kingdom better than his father could. So, if you will, just pick up with me. We're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 15. I'm going to read verses 1 through 14, and then we're just going to kind of go through it together. So, starting in verse 1, it says, After this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, From what city are you? And he said, Your servant is of such and such tribe of Israel. And Absalom would say to him, See, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you. Then Absalom would say, Oh, that I were the judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice. And whenever a man came near to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And at the end of the 40 years, Absalom said to the king, Please let me go and pay my vow, for which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I lived in Geshur in Aram, saying, If the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord. And the king said to him, "Go in peace." So he arose and went to Hebron, and Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king at Hebron." When with Absalom went 200 men from Jerusalem who were invited guests, and they went in their innocence and knew nothing. And while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for, correct me if I say this wrong, Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor from the city of Gilo. And the conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing. And when the messenger came to David, saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel have gone over to Absalom," then David said to all of his servants who were at Jerusalem, "Arise and let us flee, or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly and bring us down, or bring down ruin on us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword." So, needless to say, Absalom has got a bit of a following now. He's got this large swath of people. And the first point that I want to make to you guys is that Absalom's pride and arrogance made him do some sneaky stuff. He did some corrupt things in order to get power. He did not get power through an honorable way. He did not get power through a vote. He did not get power through the rightful kind of lineage that Israel was going to follow through. Rather, he was sneaky, right? He created hatred for his fathers. We see that in verses 1 through 6, where as people came to want to have a dispute with the king, Absalom would kind of stop them and be like, "Oh, there's no one to hear your plea, but I'll hear your plea so that, you'll follow me," in this kind of sense. And he's kind of doing these backhanded, like, "Oh, I love you," but he's not really loving his people. He's really just trying to get power. One of the next one is, he lies to David, his father, and the king, the rightful king of Israel, put there by God, lies to him about why he needs to go to Hebron. He says that he made a vow that he would go and worship God, but in actuality, he was leaving so that he could kind of capture Hebron, and get this large group of people together and almost create like a civil war in Israel. With he had his followers, the followers of Absalom, and then David would obviously have some loyalty and some loyal followers with him. And then in verses 10 through 12, we see that Absalom used people to make himself look stronger than he really was, right? Way stronger than he was. And then in verses 13 and 14, this is the moment that Absalom had wanted. He got his power, right? And this is David fleeing from his own son because of his son's arrogance, and at this point also because of David's somewhat arrogance in himself as well, that David said that, in his mind, that he could kind of neglect the nation of Israel, nothing would happen. And this is kind of that going back and biting him a little bit. So, but let's move into the second point and into our other section of scripture here, which is in 2 Samuel 18, where we see Absalom's eventual death. So we start in verse 1 of chapter 18, where it says, "Then David mustered the men who were with him and set them over commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the men, I myself will go out with you. But the men said, You shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are of worth of 10,000 of us. Therefore it is better that you would send us help from the city. And the king said to them, Whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood at the side of the gate, while all the army marched out hundreds and by thousands. And the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. And Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. And a certain man saw it and told Joab, Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. And Joab said to the man who told him, What, you saw him? Then why did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. But the man said to Joab, Even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom. And on the other hand, if I dealt treacherously against his life, and there's nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. And Joab said, I will not waste my time like this with you. And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom. and while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. And then, real quick, skip down to verse 31 with me. It says, "And behold, the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, 'Good news for the Lord, my king. For the Lord has delivered you to this day from the hand of all who rose up against you.' And the king said to the Cushite, 'Is it well with the young man Absalom?' And the Cushite answered, 'May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man.' And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, 'Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son.'" So we see a really emotional and strong depiction here of Absalom's death and kind of what happened. You know, David really here displays both honor and a little dishonor in some senses. In verses 1 through 5 of Second Samuel, we see him being very honorable, right? He says, I want to go out there and do this with you, right? He also shows humility because when they say, no, you are way too important and powerful for you to get killed in this forest, he says, okay, you guys do what you want to do. Someone who has an arrogant problem is probably not going to do that, right? Absalom himself dies because of his arrogance, right? His arrogance that he can run in here and run through the forest on this mule, and he basically gets his head stuck in a tree. And because he gets his head stuck in a tree, he is easy pickings for a murder to happen. And the way that Absalom died is not honorable. It is not something that we should take as, oh yeah, we should do that. This was a sinful moment as well for the men that killed him. They went against King David's orders, and they killed a man that was defenseless. Which is, in any sense of the word, not okay. But really, out of this, what we see is that Absalom wanted to override God's plan. He wanted to say, I know what I need to do. I know that I have the power to do this. So he's going to override God's plan. And he says, I'm ready to be king. When the fact of the matter was, he's not ready to be king. He attempted to complete his own plan outside of God's will, which never works out, by the way. You can read that in any scripture. And see that when we go with our own plan and try to work outside the will of God, it never works out. And God's will ultimately be done, right? David stayed king because God wanted David to stay king. And that's the fact of the matter. So one more scripture I want to share with you guys is Matthew 23:12, where it says, "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." Exaltation or exalt just means to lift up, right? It just means to put above, right? And a lot of times in our arrogance, we want to put ourselves up, right? But the fact of the matter is that when we humble ourselves, we are in sense exalting the Lord, right? We are lifting the Lord up, and because of that, the Lord will lift us up, right? So when you think you know best, and you see pride welling up in your life, I want you guys to remember this verse. If you humble yourself, you can make a somewhat safe bet that you'll be okay. However, if you attempt to put yourself above God for any reason whatsoever, then you can guarantee that you will be humbled very quickly and sometimes harshly. So how can we kind of stay humble and keep away from arrogance? Well, 4 points that I just want to quickly mention to you, and then I will move on to kind of the conclusion here and get you guys into some conversation. But 4 things I want us to do is identify our arrogance. So, obviously, the beginning to knowing you have a problem is admitting that you have one. So admitting that you have an arrogance issue. Think of yourself less often. Now, the writer C.S. Lewis once said of a humble person that they will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking about himself at all. So really what that means is it's not about you saying like, oh, I don't matter, I don't know. That's kind of the exact opposite, right? Humility is really just saying like, ooh, I'm going to think of how I can help lift up or care for others more often than I'm going to think of how I can put myself above others, if that makes sense. The next one is admit that you don't know everything. The fact of the matter is, you don't know anything. I don't know everything. You don't know everything. There's plenty of stuff. If you look at this wall behind me, there's plenty of smarter men behind me in all these books than that have probably forgotten more than I'll ever learn. So kind of figuring that out and then moving right into the 4th point, which is we should be willing to learn. We should be willing to learn of anything and everything, always understanding that there is someone smarter than you in the room and someone who can lead you and guide you to a point of where you can eventually get to a point where you're starting to lead and guide others. But never forget that there's someone always above you Most of the time, that's human, but in every circumstance, it's Jesus and Christ above you. So, finally, I want you guys to remember the reason why humility is so important in Scripture is because the biggest act of humility that has ever been done ever was Christ's sacrifice for you. You know, Christ, part of the triune God, right? The Trinity of the Father. So God incarnate comes down into the earth, right, as his son Jesus, takes on a sinful body, him being uh, sinless, right, but his body and having to deal with the sin in the world, right? He left a perfect place to come to a sinful one, but he remained sinless, right? Remained perfect, remained blameless, and yet took on the worst of the sinner's deaths in an act of humility that can never be replicated. So I want you guys to remember that, that when we are feeling arrogant or when we think that, we have the opportunity to kind of put ourselves over on someone, that's just not the case. That Jesus died for us when he did not have to. He was humble when he did not need to be humble, when he had every reason to be, air quote, arrogant. He had every reason to not do what he did, but he did. So as we end tonight, think of that. Understand that without Jesus' ultimate act of humility and selflessness, that none of us would be here today. So I hope you guys have a really great discussion tonight, and I'm super, super excited to kind of start this new step and new phase of the youth group with you guys. So see you later.